Hey guys, Jared from Parker Mountain Machine here. Today we're going to be doing a install video for the FN MK20 system utilizing the PMM MLOK Rail systems that we designed for that platform. Tools that you are going to need for the installation is a torque wrench. This is an FN Armorer's torque wrench that's preset to 62 inch-pounds. This is also part of the FN Scar Armorer's kit tool. It's got a T25 Torx bit that's included in it. If you don't have that, you can just use a standard T25 socket type system to remove the bolts. Other criticals are this Allen key, which is for the M4 hardware. That's actually in the rail system on the gun. And then we supply you with a vial of Loctite 242. So the rail system for the MK20, pretty simple, straightforward. It's an M-Lok lower rail, 2 side rails. Some design feature changes on these. They utilize the factory J-spring. So first and foremost, make sure the weapon's clear and safe to work on. If you're not familiar with the takedown procedure of any of the SCAR systems, first thing that you're going to do is you want to flip it vertically, the 12 o'clock rail, push out this front takedown pin for the lower on the gun. Once that takedown pin is out, simply push the lower receiver forward, lower comes off. Set that to the side. Next process is going to be the removal of the buttstock assembly on the SCAR. It's really pretty straightforward. Left hand on the upper receiver, right hand on the lower, or the stock I should say. Stock comes off. Now that the stock is out of the gun, we have our recoil and our bolt carrier assembly in here. Recoil spring and bolt carrier assembly that needs to come out. Recoil spring, simple. Just push it up with your thumb. It's going to slide out. With the bolt carrier slid back to where the charging handle can be pulled out of the upper receiver, remove the charging handle, and proceed to pull the bolt carrier assembly out of the receiver. So that's your basic field strip of any of the SCAR platforms. That's going to include the MK16, MK17, as well as the 20S here. Next thing that we're going to do with this particular weapon system is where you're going to loosen the T25s, where the barrel yoke is, where the breech block extension is, as well as the T25s in the front trunnion. Now you've got 3 towards the rear, 1 on the front at the 3 o'clock position, same 3 on the rear, and 1 towards the front on the 9 o'clock position. We'll go ahead and do that now. Using our T25 Torx bit and just a 1/4 inch ratchet, going to pull these guys up and out. That clicking you hear on the weapon system is the J-spring assembly engaging a serrated bolt inside this plastic carrier here that actually pushes the bolts up and out away from the upper receiver. Pretty ingenious design on part of FN for keeping all the hardware captive on all these guns. So in the event that you need to do a barrel swap in the field, you don't have to worry about losing hardware. So now that we're done here on the 9 o'clock position, we're going to flip the rifle over and we're going to proceed to do the exact same thing, the opposite side. Now that we have all the barrel mounting bolts loose, you can see that they're protruding out of these black plastic walnut shaped things in the rear, as well as the front of the 1913 rail. All you need to do at this point is simply push the barrel forward. The barrel is going to pull forward, and you'll see that the back of the breech block assembly will be approximately 1/8 of an inch in front of this cut in the upper receiver extrusion. The barrel pops up and out, and we can put our receiver to the side for now. Now that we have the MK20 barrel out of the gun, what you need to do is take the breech block assembly in a vise with preferably soft jaws. That could be Delrin like what you see here. These are just a formable plastic that I got on Amazon, or even sheets of aluminum. And what I recommend is you can squeeze this in your vise to to hold the barrel. The reason that I'm doing this right now for the film purposes is when this barrel is out of the upper receiver, you're going to need to apply heat, direct heat source, either to the head of this bolt with a soldering iron, which you're going to need like a 50 watt Kohler, or Wohler I should say, soldering iron, or a MAP gas or propane type source. Now I say that lightly because you want to be careful in doing this, but with the MAP gas, typically what I'll do is I'll get a light flame and I put it underneath here under the 1913 rail, and I keep an eye on the countersink portion of this T25 bolt on the 1913 rail, and what you'll see is kind of like a little smoke or a little bubbling come up around it. When that starts to bubble, that means that's hot enough where you can use your T25 Torx bit to get into the bolt and turn it out. This is usually pretty easy. This is going to be pretty easy for me. Like I said, this particular gun has been taken apart multiple times. So get that bolt out of there. We're free and clear on the barrel now and the factory 1913 rail. Now that we have the lower 1913 rail off of the barrel, the next thing that we need to apply heat to is the front T25 bolt. This T25 bolt holds in the front yoke or horseshoe clamp, whatever you want to call it, that adds stability to the front end of the upper receiver on the Mark 20. Same process, apply heat directly to the head of the bolt and or underneath directly to the center of this horseshoe, and that heat is going to allow you to remove that bolt much easier than normally. So that one cracked free here. We want to separate the yoke from the rail and just put it to the side. So this is just a quick side note with the barrel out of the upper receiver of the Mark 20. I've already removed one of the M4 bolts for the 1913 rail on this side, but what we have in this system, it's a little different than what you'd find with your traditional Mark 16 or Mark 17. These are some flat, I guess, well nut type washer spacers that the M4 bolts go through the rail and are captive in. And FN does install these using a locking compound. And what I recommend with the barrel out of the upper receiver is if you have a torch or the soldering iron again, you can apply direct heat to these each individual pieces. These two pieces here are steel. The one in the front, like you would find on a Mark 16 or a Mark 17, this is a 7075 aluminum, so this is going to pick up heat much faster. The one caveat to consider here is you've got to be very, very careful with the amount of heat that you apply to these, because we do have polymer rails on the back side of the upper receiver and they could potentially melt. But the only reason I'm suggesting the application of heat directly to these is it's going to make your life a lot easier in the process of removing the M4 bolts. That way that they don't strip. Now that the heat has been applied to the back side of the M4 bolts, it's as simple as just turning them counterclockwise, and you're going to do that directly down the line of the upper receiver. Make sure you capture that T-nut on the back side with your finger, because it's going to want to rotate out. That's what it looks like. And we'll just go straight down the line. Just a quick note on this. Now that we have all M4 bolts removed from the side rails, this front T25, just be careful lifting it off the receiver. It does have a J-spring on the back side there. That J-spring assembly, you don't want to lose it, and it is under tension in most applications. If the bolt's out, see how that just flung out? You can lose that little J-spring. You're going to need to keep that. So here's a quick side note on the parts that are being reused from the FN SCAR Mark 20 system in the PMM MLOK Rail system. Both of your J-springs, your 7075 square nuts, 2 of the 4 T-nuts with the large bosses, and your 2 front T25 bolts. PMM supplied parts are going to be M4 by 8mm bolts with a large diameter head. There's a total of 2 of those. 2 PMM T-nuts with a smaller boss, 2 M4 by 8 millimeter bolts with a smaller diameter head, and 2 M4 by 10 millimeter bolts with a smaller diameter head. Now, taking one of the PMM MLOK rails, you want to take the T25 bolt from FN, drop it in the rail, as well as one of your J-springs, and you want to install the J-spring into the front portion of the rail. I find it's easiest to push up on the bolt and then push down on the back side of the J-spring to put it under spring tension load. That way it holds in the rail. Once that's held captive, we'll proceed to mounting it to the side of the Mark 20 upper receiver. Now, taking your PMM MLOK rail system with the J-spring installed, you drop it onto the upper receiver for the Mark 20. Holding it to the side, we want to flip it up and assure we have a nice tight fit along the upper receiver and the rail system. Now that we have the J-spring assembly and the T25 bolt installed and the rail on the side of the upper receiver, we're now going to take the FN supplied T-nut with the longer boss, and we're going to drop that on the back side of the upper receiver and let it sit in there. You then take the PMM supplied M4 by 8 millimeter large diameter head bolt on the back side of the rail and lightly thread it into position. Once that's captured, you take the PMM supplied T-nut, drop it in the mid position of the rail. Let me flip this around. Take your M4 by 8 millimeter bolt with the small head, and that will drop inside of the M-Lok rail and slot and capture that T-nut. There'll be a slight protrusion there. Now that we have the M4 T-nuts installed on the rail, we want to take the 7075 square nut, and you want to install it so the side with the least amount of material is facing down towards the 6 o'clock position of the rifle. Slide that in there, and if you take the PMM supplied M4 by 10 millimeter small head bolt, you slide that in through the M-Lok rail, get it started in there, and cinch it up. So we now have all three of these installed. And you'll notice that this bolt has a slight bit of protrusion here. Not going to be an issue when the gun's back together. Nothing will crash. Proper installation of the PMM MLOK side rails will go as follows. This is your M4 by 8 millimeter bolt with a large diameter head. It's approximately 310 thousandths in diameter. The mid mounting point, which engages the PMM supplied T-nut, is an M4 by 8 millimeter small diameter head, approximately 280 thousandths in diameter. And then the front mounting point, which engages the 7075 square nut, uses the PMM supplied M4 by 10 millimeter long bolt that has a head diameter of approximately 280 thousandths. And the last but not least, our T25 bolt, factory FN bolt, and the J-spring is held captive in there. One side note that I'd like to touch on here real quickly, we do supply you with a Loctite 242. The Loctite 242 is intended to be used on all four of these M4 bolts. No Loctite should ever be used on this bolt. This is a barrel yoke bolt, and it's intended to be free floating and captured by the J-spring. That way you can pull the barrel in and out of the upper receiver in the field. Loctite 242 should be applied to all 6 bolts, 3 on each side, that engage the square nut and both of the T-nut fasteners on the rail system. Now that we have the side rails installed on the upper receiver of the Mark 20, the last bit of the puzzle is the lower rail section. We will only be reusing the forward barrel yoke supplied by FN for the Mark 20. PMM supplies 2 new T25 bolts as well as the full M-Lok lower rail section. Taking the FN manufactured front barrel yoke, you'll notice that there is an offset between the hole centers from front to rear. We want to align that in the lower rail. So the side where there is less material is going to get flipped and pushed into the front portion of the PMM supplied M-Lok rail. And if I flip that over now, you'll see that it's a perfect alignment for the hole. Taking one of your PMM supplied T25 bolts, you will apply some of the Loctite 242 to the threads and install this into the rail, and you can torque this to 62 inch-pounds. Now that we have the front barrel yoke attached to the rail system, we're simply going to bolt the lower rail system into the breech block assembly here on the barrel for the Mark 20. Pretty straightforward application here. We have a machined extrusion that is going to simply mount into the breech block, and if you look in there, the countersunk hole will line up with the threaded portion of that assembly. Applying some Loctite 242, we're just going to thread this down and in. Once again, this T25 bolt will get torqued to 62 inch-pounds. We now have the PMM MLOK rails attached to the side of the upper receiver, as well as the lower rail section to the barrel assembly. Prior to inserting the barrel into the upper receiver, make sure that the 2 T25 bolts are sticking out of the rails, as well as the 6 in the rear that lock into the breech block assembly. That's critical to get the barrel to slide in. If they're not protruding out, the barrel will not slide in. We're simply going to take the FN barrel, we're going to drop it in to the receiver the same way that we took it out. You'll notice that we have that 1/8 inch gap here between the receiver extrusion and the back of the breech block. Once that's in there, simply going to slide it in the front. You want to make sure you align the barrel yoke and rail system. She's in. Now that we have the barrel and the upper receiver, we need to tighten the barrel bolts down. Starting in the rear, you want to hand tighten these until they stop. And you can hand tighten them going all the way down the line, moving from rear to front. And we will come back and revisit the torque sequence in the next segment, which is critical. Now that we have the barrel installed and the T25 bolts hand tightened, we need to go down the line and torque them. I'm using the FN supplied torque wrench in the Armorer's kit, and the orientation and the manner in which these are torqued in is critical, so please pay attention. Starting on the right side of the weapon system, we're going to do the rearmost bolt. Tighten it. We're then going to flip the receiver to the rearmost bolt. Torque it. 62 inch-pounds. Alright? We're going to flip it back. Middle. Flip it over. Middle. Front. Front. And then the barrel yoke in the front. Either or is fine. Now that we have the barrel installed in the upper receiver and the bolts are torqued in, assembly is as simple as the way that we tore it down. If your bolt carrier is dirty, like mine, might be an opportunity to clean it, but since I'm me, nah. Let's slide the bolt carrier in to where the charging handle lines up with the extrusion. Put the charging handle in there. Send the bolt all the way forward into battery, and take the recoil assembly, the buffer pad, slide it in. Note orientation, it's a male to female fit. Can't really fit a square box into a round hole in this application, so if this is flipped upside down, don't smash it in there. Push that guy in there. Take your stock, pop that back down, lower, forward. Gun is now together. Function test, verify the chamber is clear. Trigger brakes from a reset. There's your reset. Brakes again. And that is the PMM FN MLOK Rail system for the Mark 20. So you'll notice with the M-Lok kit for the Mark 20 that PMM also supplies a total of 8 bolts. You might be asking yourself, what are these 8 bolts for? These 8 bolts are critical for the Mark 20, Mark 16, or Mark 17 when it comes to mounting M-Lok accessories to it. Because the way that the SCAR is designed, the M-Lok slots don't have enough distance on the back side to use the normally supplied bolts for most M-Lok accessories. So we supply with every kit for the side rails 4 5/16 bolts and 4 1/4-inch long bolts that will bolt into any M-Lok T-nut. These have a Vibratite patch on them, and what you need to be aware of when using these, so this is a Magpul cantilever Picatinny rail section, is you want to make sure that when you're installing the T-nut onto your M-Lok accessory, that when it is at full lockdown, as seen here, that the back side of the bolt is not protruding beyond the foot of the T-nut. And this is extremely critical in the 2 forwardmost positions for the M-Lok slot. Because what will happen is if you have the bolt protruding below the foot of the T-nut, when this is inserted into the M-Lok slot and tightened down, the bottom of the bolt will either crash into the rail or worse, into the upper receiver on the SCAR. We supply these bolts because the nature of the way that the SCAR systems are designed, there is no way that we can get away with the longer bolts. In either case, longer bolts are going to crash into the upper receiver and or the bottom of the M-Lok slot. So just be aware of that. Any accessories that you're going to use for mounting M-Lok parts to the upper receiver, make sure you use the any of the 8 bolts that we supply, and if you need more, we always have more on the website.